Maria Gillen, and I am the storyteller in residence for Kerry Writers Museum. This weekend we had an amazing time because we were looking at the traditions of our food. So, in fact, we had the Listowel Food Festival. There you can see it, and it went on from the 12th to the 14th of November. We have so much to celebrate, and one of the things that I really love about the nourishment of our food is that it doesn't just feed our bodies, but it feeds our souls and our traditions. So, where do these traditions come from? Well, here in the south of Ireland, we are very lucky to have the butter roads that were walked into existence by our ancestors. There are many butter roads, but the one I'm thinking of at the moment stretches all the way from Ventry in County Kerry through our beautiful rugged landscapes up towards Cork and the famous butter exchange on the top of Shandon Street. So that's where our story takes place. And I'd like to thank Eamon Keenan. Hello, Eamon. Eamon is one of our followers, and he requested that one of the stories that we celebrated over the weekend be posted up on our web page for our web followers. So this one is for you, Eamon. And if you ever go to Ulster, Eamon is a great storyteller and a great man to take you on a tour of the fairy trees of Ulster. Now let's come back down south. Let's come to where Cork and Kerry and Limerick meet, around the village of Knocknagree. There was a woman that came there in the middle of the night. Her name was Moira, and she had a beautiful daughter called Saoirse. It was a mark of the woman that no one asked how she had come to live in that little town with her daughter one evening. They took over the small holding, and immediately people could see the difference. Before, where there was little patches of brown earth in the green grass, now there was luscious little beds of all kinds of lavender and wild garlic, vegetables, and of course the little green grass that was around the edges as well. And she made out of that the great medicines that people longed for. She was called mostly by men who didn't like to go and see doctors, or by farmers who couldn't afford vets. She would come with her lotions and her potions, and it seemed that she had magic in her hands, for she was able to cure people. She was able to put her hand on the belly of a cow and know what ailed it. Or she was able to take the hands of a man and just from holding knew which tea to give him to make him feel better. Now, in this town of Knocknagree, they had many traditions. They had large families and they had great music, the beautiful Sliabh Lucra music of this region. There was a family there, and they were called the O'Sullivans. The man of the house was called Sean, and his grandfather was called Shan Sean, and his son was called Sean Og. And this was another tradition because names in families followed people, so that the same names would come up over and over again. It was often the tradition that the youngest son in the house would go to live with the grandparents in hopes of the small holding. This was no hardship at all on Sean Og, for he loved his grandfather and he loved playing music with him. It was said in the area that Shan Sean could take his bow down and start a conversation on his fiddle, and that Sean Og could then take his bow down and finish that conversation. What nights they had in front of the fire on cold November nights, just like what we're experiencing at the moment. And if people were passing and they should hear the music, sure they'd feel They're absolutely entitled to walk through the door and join in that session. But as the years went by, Shan Shan found that it took longer and longer for him to warm up his hands so that he could take the bow down and make that beautiful music. On the evenings when the pain was really bad and his knuckles were really swollen, he'd say to Sean Og, "Run up the hill there now, boy. Run up that hill on your young, strong legs and tell Moira I have need of her." And Moira would come down, and as she walked through the door, she'd say the blessing. She'd say, "God bless all here," and immediately the place would feel lighter. He'd sit next to her and she'd take his hands and look into his eyes. And sometimes just the heat of the massage that she'd give his hands was enough to have him playing again. But as time went on, she had to supplement this with teas, and there was always a difference, never the same tea twice. Sometimes she'd have the wild garlic and a little bit of lavender and some other secret things. And other times there might be some smuera duva, some blackberries in it as well, to give the taste a lift. And sometimes even there was some of her magic honey, honey from the area that could cure all sorts of things. And he used to look forward to her company as much as he looked forward to her menstruations. The time came, as it must come to us all, when Shan Shan left this world. This is the month of November, the month when we remember those that have gone before us. And in that year, Sean Og began to write his grandfather's name at the top of the list of the people that he would remember in November. He'd sit then in the old cottage, looking at the cold hearth, for he didn't have the heart to light the fire there. And he would look at his bow crossed over his grandfather's, up over that empty fire. It was a cold winter in his heart, in his soul, and in the hearth of that fire. But nature is a very wise thing, and in the spring she called him with the music of the birds. He heard outside his window one morning. "Oh," he said, and he smiled for the first time in a long time. The first thing that happened was he felt guilty for waking up smiling. But then the tickle of nature would not leave his soul alone, and he took the bow down from its place over the fire, still unable to sit in his chair facing his grandfather's empty chair. So out he went and sat on the windowsill, and that day he played the sad tunes. La 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 la. And you know how it is. He felt someone watching him. You know how it is when you feel someone watching you and you think, "I'm not going to look around." And you resist and you resist. But after a while, your head turns of its own volition. And when he looked round, up at the top of the hill, out from amongst the trees, he saw the beautiful face of Saoirse, Moira's daughter. Saoirse meaning freedom, and she was a free soul. She smiled at him. Oh, and it warmed his heart. Day by day he sat at the end of that hill and he played his music. Inch by inch over the days she came a little bit further down the hill, until the day came when he finished playing the music and he turned his face and he was looking deeply into her eyes and she into his. They knew. They knew in that moment that they were meant for one another, that they wanted to walk this earth side by side and shoulder to shoulder. Oh my goodness, Now he'd have to ask Moira, the woman with the knowing, if it was okay for him to walk out her daughter. Oh my goodness. And so the next thing that happened was that he knocked on Moira's door. But when he did, sure, she had the water on the boil for the last 10 minutes, knowing that he was coming, and she was stopping herself from putting on the bread. She opened the door. "How can I help you?" she said. And he said, "Oh, God bless all here." He was wearing his grandfather's shirt, the collar a little bit too big for him, and the tie tight on his Adam's apple in his nervousness. "I was wondering if it would be okay for me to walk out your daughter." "Is that right?" she said. "And how do you consider yourself grown up enough to be walking out a woman?" "Oh," he said, "well, the cottage has come to me, the small holding, the little garden, and I will be able to feed a family from that." "Will you?" she said. "And what about wisdom?" "Wisdom," he said. "Indeed. Do you know what are the three nourishments of the road?" The three nourishments of the road. And he leant back on the heels of his shoes and thought about it. And she was very glad of his answer. "I don't know," he said. "I don't, but I'm going to find out. For I'll take to the road, Moira, and I'll come back with the answer. Three nourishments, you say? Three nourishments." "Three," she said, and she smiled at him. "I'll take the road to Cork," he said. "Have you anything for me to deliver up there?" "Oh," she said, "I have a firkin of butter." Do you know what a firkin of butter is? It's 100 weight. Imagine that. And people brought that in on their hand carts. He went home now to get his hand cart and collected the firkin of butter from Moira. Down the road he went until he heard his name. "Sean Og! Sean Og!" He turned around and there was Saoirse running down the road towards him. "Sean," she said, "a prata le de foca, a potato for your pocket." In those days, people would boil great pots of potatoes in the morning, and then they would take them out of the pots, still in their skins, one for each pocket, and it would keep their hips warm, and their hands too, if they should put their hands in. And in the case of our Sean Og, it kept his heart warm as well, to see his Saoirse thinking like this about his needs. "Now," she said, all serious, "now remember, it's much nicer to eat with people. Don't be eating that on your own." And he thought to himself, God help her head, sure I'd have that gone in one swallow. But she was to be his wife, and he knew that her mother was a woman of the knowing, so he was going to take her word seriously. He slipped the potato into his pocket and he walked along the road, whistling away to himself. At first the road was light. Sure, he was full of the adventure of it. But after a while the road felt heavy, as if it was pulling out of the soles of his feet. Oh, and his stomach was talking to him, and that potato in his pocket was in big danger. Do you remember the Bisto ad of long ago, and how the smell would come like a little ghostly hand and tickle you under the nose and bring you to the table? Well, something like that happened to our Sean, for he smelt the beautiful smells of the 3-day stew. In Ireland long ago, along the road, they had big black pots, and in those pots they would make 3-day stew. Why 3 days, you ask? Well, people couldn't really afford meat, so they might get a bone from the butcher and put it into the pot and boil it for 3 days until it broke open and released its marrow into the soup. People put into that pot whatever they could. Sometimes they had nothing, so they'd drop a stone in, hence the name stone soup. But other people knew that there was great nourishment along the roads of Ireland. They knew how to forage, to find things like the wild garlic, or to bring in their pocket the old pearl barley. It took a while to soften and to blow up, but when it did, it thickened the soup. And of course, our famous Irish potatoes. And one of those was in Sean's pocket as this story kept going on. And the woman said, "Well now, have you anything to offer the pot?" The woman who was standing guard with her shawl around her just in front of the pot itself. "I have," he said, and he took out of his pocket the potato to present to her. "No," she said, "that's not our way. Put it in so that I can't see it." Plop! In it went, into the pot, and he could imagine it sinking to the bottom. And in return, she took out some great spoonfuls of the stew and gave him a fine, healthy bowl of it. "Oh," he said, glad to put himself on the outside of that. It didn't take him long, and each spoonful tasted a little bit different from the spoon that had gone before it. That is the magic of an Irish stew. And with a full belly, he thought to himself, I know the first nourishment of the road. It's the fine food of Ireland, the food that you find along the way, and the food that we share in these beautiful pots." Oh, he was so happy with himself that he picked up the handcart and he walked and walked through the moonlit night. But when the day was coming into its birth, he decided that he needed to take a little rest. So he put down the handcart and he rolled himself up in an old blanket and slept under the hedges until he could hear the people walking past him, all on the same journey, the butter roads of Ireland. And he shook himself off and he began to walk along. And anyone that he met, he said, "Do you know the three nourishments of the road?" "I know one of them. Here's the one I know. It's the beautiful food of Ireland and the food that you can find along the way and the old traditions of the food and the knowledge of the food." And people listened to him and they wondered at wisdom in such a young man. And then he said, "But I need the two more nourishments because my happiness depends on it. My love for Saoirse depends on it. Do you know what the other two nourishments of the road are?" And people offered opinions, but they didn't feel right to him. And then, just as his legs were getting heavy again, he heard the beautiful notes of the Sliabh Luachra music coming out to reach him over Barn and Kinnick, over the top of the hill. Rat-ta-ta-ta, rat-ta-ta-ta, la 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 went the music, and up went his heart, and fast went his feet, and he took that handcart as if it weighed nothing and pushed it up the hill, and on the other side, at the crossroads, he saw the fire lit, people dancing in a set, and all the musicians with the best seats next to that fire. He was already pulling the bow out of his backpack as he was running down the hill. "Can I join in? Can I join in?" he said. "Oh, I don't know now," said the old men, winking at one another. "What makes you think you can play?" "Oh, listen to this," he said, full of confidence of his playing. And he played the old tunes. And if he did, the men looked at one another in the knowing way and said, "Here, are you anything to Sean Sullivan?" "I'm his grandson," he said. "Ah, you'd know it. The print of his music is upon you." Well, he was delighted with that compliment. And that night, as he played music and listened to stories, he heard stories of his grandfather when his grandfather was a young man, before he'd met his grandmother, before he became a father, well before he became a grandfather. It was such an insight, and he thought to himself, this is our second nourishment of the road, our great stories, our songs, our dancing, and the way we hold our history and traditions in those things. Oh my goodness, I know what the second nourishment of the road is. And he was delighted with himself, and he told everyone there. And everybody around that fire knew two nourishments of the road, but they struggled yet for the third nourishment. What could it be? What could be the third nourishment of the road? All the way into Cork, he asked anybody that would listen. All the way into Cork, he did not get an answer. Finally, he handed over the firkin of butter, and he got a fair price for it, which he sewed into his vest, because that was the tradition of the time, to keep the money safe over your heart. And he made for home. It was a much shorter journey on the way home, for he knew the road, and of course his handcart was lighter. And he walked until he came to the village of Knocknagree, his heart heavy. But then he smelt his mother's apple tart. You know, an Irish mammy's apple tart that has a little bit of cinnamon in it, and you can also almost smell the caramelizing sugar on the top of it. Oh, he went into his mam's house and he said, "Mum," and he told her everything that I've told you. And she looked up to heaven and said, "Oh, am I rearing Egypts? Is it Egypts I'm rearing?" "What, ma'am?" he said. "Don't you know what the third nourishment of the road is?" "Do you know what it is, ma'am?" "Ah, no," she said. "Did you talk to everybody on the way to Cork?" "I did." "And did you not get an answer?" "I got loads of answers, ma'am, but not the right one." "Did you bend the ear of every soul on the way back?" "I did, ma'am. I did, because this is so important to me, but I didn't get the answer." "The third nourishment," she said, "is the fine people, our tribe, our clan. As you walked along the road, they mightn't have known the answer, but they stood shoulder to shoulder with you. They sat heart to heart with you. They filled your belly." "They did," he said. "That is the third nourishment of the road." And he got up and made to run past her. But you know the Irish mammy's hooked fingers. As he was going past, she stuck her fingers into the collar of his shirt and pulled him back. "Where are you going?" she said. "I'm going up to Sullivan's," he said, "to tell Moira that I know the three nourishments of the road." "Indeed, Nan, you're not," she said, "or there'll be a divorce before there's a wedding." "Ah, ma'am," he said. And Moira echoed this as she looked into her pot up in her own small holding, for now she had to wait. She had to wait for 7 o'clock or until the cock crew before she'd get the news of the three nourishments of the road. Sure, she knew what the nourishments of the road were already. Well, it was said that the wedding of Sean and Saoirse went on for 3 days and lit the whole village of Knocknagree. It is said that their relations still live there to this day, and they tell the story of the three nourishments of the road. I hope you liked that story. It's a story that I wrote for Mary Walsh of the Gab because she wanted me to enter the Butter Roads competition, and it was a winner then, and I hope that it's a winner now. And I hope you enjoyed the story of our traditions of the road. Talk to you soon. Maria Gillen, the storyteller in residence at Kerry Writers Museum.